I first became involved in this now 10 years ago. Minnie reminded me. Thanks for reminding me that it was 10 years ago, Minnie, that I first met all of you people. Became involved in this. In fact, the year before I first came over, when Todd Fernie, who some of you may have known and who have heard, I'm sure, a lot about, came up to me after I'd spoken at a conference in Melbourne, and he came up in Todd's incredibly charming way and just said to me, I love what you were talking about there. He said, if I could get the resources together, I work for Auckland University of Technology, if I could get the resources together, would you come over to New Zealand and share those same thoughts in New Zealand? I said, sure, of course I'll do that, that'd be great. It took Todd, I think, nearly 12 months to bring together the resources to do that, but he did so. And I came over and had the first of what have been wonderful experiences over here in New Zealand. All I really did was to share my very simple, and I think it's a very, very simple thinking or philosophy, whatever you want to call it, model for disability reform that I put together years ago. And I'll share with you some of my thought processes that came up with that. And I'll do that for two reasons. Firstly, because I guess we are talking generally here about disability issues, so the topic of that model is obviously relevant. But I thought it might also be of some value to you if I shared just some of the process and thinking that I went through to lead to this model. But Todd basically heard this model and said, I think that's great, could you come over and share that in New Zealand, which I did. And as I say, I went away from that first trip here to New Zealand just totally in awe of the opportunity that I felt here. I've come back, I think, 3-4 times over the years, and each time I've come back feeling even more excited. And to be quite frank, if I could get a charter flight back to Australia now and put a couple of you people on that flight now, I'd bring you back to Australia and say, can you please help me do this in Australia as well? Because this is really amazing how far this has all come. And you felt the sense of excitement of it. But that model, I guess, that I came across and shared all those years ago, that Minnie and Todd and others picked up and have further developed and have made part of this whole Be initiative, was a very, and I still think, very, very simple sort of thinking about disability. And I think it's one of the most important things that we as leaders need to do in leading other people to a new place. And that is to be able to describe in simple and exciting terms what the destination we're hoping people will come with us to, what that destination looks like. In fact, I think leadership in many ways is like being a travel agent. Stick with me. In the end, the reason we are leaders is because we believe there's a better place to be, that things can change for the better. That represents a journey. It represents a journey from where we are at the moment, a place that we feel could be and should be improved, to a new place that we feel is better. And in that sense, it is a little like a travel agent. I often think one of the key roles of a travel agent when, let's take a scenario. An elderly couple who've done okay during their lives, but they've not branched out and gone overseas, they've not gone on long trips. They've always talked about it, but they've never really quite done that. And they've decided, we've just retired, it's time we really did something about this. So they go and see their travel agent. The first thing the travel agent needs to do, if he or she is going to convince that couple to make this big journey that they're perhaps both excited about but also fearful about, is to build a picture of the destination. What's it going to look like when we get there? I've for the first time, decided I want to go overseas, but I've never been overseas before. What's it look like over there? Do they have hotel rooms over there when I get to this foreign destination? What will I do when I'm there? Will the people treat me nicely? Well, you can imagine all of these sorts of thinkings and doubts that might be going through people's minds. So the first task of the travel agent or the leader is to build a picture of what that destination looks like. Yep, there are hotel rooms. Let me show you some pictures. Let me show you a bit of video. This is what it looks like. It's a great place. I've been there, and so on. The second task of the leader or the travel agent is to make the person or the people feel confident about the journey itself. Okay, now I feel excited about getting there, but what's it going to be like to get there? I've never been on an aircraft before. What happens? I'm scared of heights. I'm scared of being in a small space. Is it bumpy? What happens on this journey? The second task of the travel agent is to give the individuals confidence that that journey is a safe journey, that it can be made. This is what it feels like. This is how this happens. And then the third and I think final major thing that the leader or the travel agent needs to do, I'm going to shift my mode of transport from aircraft to train now because it just helps to illustrate. The travel agent needs to be standing on the train now. I don't think a leader can be standing on the platform encouraging others to get up onto the train. The leader needs to be on the train, offering a helping hand to the individuals. Come with me on this journey. Step up onto this train. We are going to make this journey together. And I think those three things are the mark of true leaders. If we as leaders can achieve those three things, we will bring people with us. You will bring New Zealand with you on this wonderful, exciting bee journey that you're embarking on. It's enormously challenging. It's very easy to say those three things, but it's enormously challenging to do those things. But it is also enormously rewarding. Let me then tell you a little bit about this thinking that was building a picture, I felt, of the destination that I see for disability reform and the journey that needs to be taken to get there. It's a model or a description of all of this that I describe as the whole of life approach to disability, but it's a very, very simple thinking. I've spent most of my professional life in the business sector, as we heard before, and that experience has given me some wonderful, wonderful skills. I absolutely loved my 28 years with IBM. In fact, it was the most difficult decision, career-wise at least, I think I've ever made to leave the company after 28 years, to branch out on my own. It's a decision I always knew I would make. I didn't think it would take me 28 years to make that decision, but I knew it's a decision that one day I would make, and I knew that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, as much as I absolutely love technology, play around with it all the time, I have more capacity to screw up computers than you would believe. I love it, and I think one of the reasons why I screw up so many computers is that I think I know a lot more about it than I actually do. But I've loved the technology, so being in IBM was a fantastic place to be, right at the leading edge of technology. But I was also working for a company that I unashamedly say over and over again is the best organisation I have ever had any involvement with. They gave me absolutely every opportunity you can imagine to grow as an individual. So I had the opportunity to move through the ranks, to move across the business. And as a result of that, I developed some high-level skills, some strategic thinking, planning, management skills. And I always realised, as much as I loved working for IBM, that in fact, in the end, I didn't feel overly passionate about selling computers, which is ultimately what IBM does. What I've always been passionate about is being part of this process of making the world a better place. But I did realise fairly early on in my career in IBM that some of the skills that I was learning were skills that I think we desperately need to apply to sorting out complex social issues. And it was several years after I'd started to work for IBM, I brought together a group of people in Australia, quite sort of senior and influential people, including the chair of IBM at the time. And I remember having a board meeting of this organisation we call the Ability Australia Foundation. And I presented to the board some statistics that I'd just received from the federal government that showed the participation rates of people with disabilities in Australia in employment and education. I had received that report for the last 15 years before that, and so I was able to compare year to year whether we were making any progress. And the answer was, yet again, that there had been no progress made in participation of people with disabilities in Australia in education and employment. And I just felt overwhelmed by that. And so I took this to the board, and Brian Finn, the chair of IBM, said to me at the time, "Mark, we've spent a lot of time sitting around this table talking about specific issues, and we've all tried to do something about these things. But," he said, "maybe now it's time to take a different approach." He said, "There are times in all of our careers and in all of our activities when doing what we have traditionally done and trying incremental improvement on what we've traditionally done no longer produces the results we need." In fact, in talking about that, Brian Finn was reflecting some of the thinking of one of the world's recognised philosophers, strategic thinking gurus, a guy called Charles Handy. If any of you ever get a chance to read some of his work, he's got some very interesting ideas. But Charles Handy put forward a model, yet another model that I adopted in my own thinking many years ago, and early on I thought very powerful view of the world. Charles Handy was saying the same thing, that every organisation in Charles Handy's view go through several stages of development. In the early stages of a start-up organisation, we often actually go backwards, put in miles and miles of effort, but we actually get decreasing returns on effort. But the organisation needs to turn a corner and start to become more productive, or it'll go out of business. Handy then says that every organisation, and usually at the most challenging time in an organisation's growth, the point at which everything is going well but just starting to go off the boil, Charles Handy suggests we need to jump onto a new curve, in his terms. And I felt at that stage that we needed to jump off onto a new curve of disability reform. Clearly what we were doing was not working. The programs and so on that we were doing were making minor improvements, but the minor improvements were not having anywhere near the overall effect. So Brian Finn said to me, "Mark, why don't you apply the same strategic thinking that I've seen you apply in business to thinking through this process of disability reform?" And when he said that, the lights just went on. So I spent months, really, even longer, just thinking through that from that simple strategic thinking perspective. So I've only got 5 minutes left, so I'll very, very quickly take you through that thinking process that came up with this whole-of-life approach and model to disability reform. In going through an exercise like that, as I'd done many times in IBM and with some of IBM's customers, I realised that there is a very big difference between management-oriented change and strategic change. Management-oriented change is incremental improvement to things we're currently doing. Strategic change is a completely different type of management and leadership. And the first thing I think that needs to be done when we approach a challenge of strategic change is to basically put aside everything that we're currently doing and saying, probably at least some of that's part of the problem. So I'm certainly not going to start by thinking about exactly what we're doing now. I'm going to start with a clean slate. And so the first thing I did was to ask myself, what is it? What are the dynamics that I'm seeing happening in the world today that are resulting in so many capable people with disabilities sitting at home doing nothing? And I came up with 3 very simple, interrelated things that I think are still pulling the majority of people with disabilities down. The first are the massive infrastructure barriers. Now, I don't need to tell anybody in the room about that. It's damn hard work to function effectively in our community with a disability. And the key point about that is that that's got nothing to do with the individual with a disability. It's the fact that we haven't designed this world to take the needs of people with disabilities into account. When only 20% of public transport's accessible to me, but 100% of public transport's accessible to everybody else, I'm likely to be less effective in the community. And that's not because of my disability, that's because the community hasn't invested in an accessible infrastructure. The second thing that was also very, very obvious to me is that the community generally doesn't expect you and doesn't expect me to make the same contribution to the community that it expects of everybody else. Now, that might be a nice caring, sharing sort of philosophy. Poor Mark is now in a wheelchair, so we need to put a rug over his lap and protect him and give him a pension and whatever. It just makes me scream, no, I do not want a rug over my lap. I want an opportunity to work. I'm as capable as working as anybody else if the infrastructure gives me the resources to be able to do so. So please, don't pity me, provide me with the opportunity and expect me to contribute to the community. And then the third interrelated factor here, and I'm sure I don't see it, I met some of you last night and I know I don't see it in this room, but I'm sure many of you would know other people with disabilities who you look at and you feel that they have just felt completely disempowered by their disability, that it's all just too hard. Now, I think it's those 3 things together that are pulling people with disabilities down. And it's the combination of those 3 things. One of the reasons we're not making the infrastructure accessible to people with disabilities is that the community's not expecting people with disabilities to make a contribution. So my next door neighbour is offering to put a rug over my lap, where I'd prefer the next door neighbour to pick up the phone to the politician and say, you don't get my vote, pal, if you don't make those buses accessible because Mark can't get to work. And the next door neighbour is feeling sorry for me because he or she is observing me sitting on the front veranda feeling completely overwhelmed by my disability. And the bus owner is seeing me feeling overwhelmed by my disability and is saying, well, what's the point in me spending that money on making the buses accessible? So these things are all related. In fact, I've got a diagram that I have used countless times in discussions that has 3 circles arranged in a triangle. And on them, the words are infrastructure barriers, community expectations, and disempowerment. And I feel that we together need to embrace that thinking and understand that there are interventions that can address every one of those issues. We desperately need the business sector to get engaged in removing the infrastructure barriers. Why? Because the business sector builds and owns the majority of the infrastructure that we find difficult to participate in. So if they're not engaged in this, it will probably never change. We need a national marketing strategy. We need so desperately to be out there talking to every New Zealander and showing how wrong this is and how much opportunity is represented by those people with disabilities in New Zealand who don't get the opportunity. And thirdly, we need to empower individuals with disability, to teach people the skills, the life skills that you have developed and are developing as part of your leadership process. We need to teach those skills to all people with disabilities so they themselves can take control of their lives. So it was that, I think, very simple thinking that I shared the first time I came here to New Zealand, and that thinking has been embraced by Minnie and Todd and many others over the years, and I felt so proud last night. I felt humbled, but so proud to just think back to that first trip I came over here and see what you've done with that very simple idea. Thank you so much for the opportunity of being here today. It's been wonderful.